It's welcome or welcome back, actually. It's one or other. As I'll explain in a minute, just to reference this in, this is a series of webinars, an ongoing series of webinars. So you might be a returning customer. If so, it's great to see you again. If you're here for the first time, my name is Jeremy Smith. I head up the banking and finance division at Kaplan. So literally in a sentence or two, what do? We do qualifications training in the financial services arena, and that's where we get bogged down with all sorts of acronyms. You might have heard of CFA exams, IOC, IMC, and so on, and we prepare delegates very thoroughly for those exams. But as well as that, we do tailored in-house, as I call it, so non-exam training, where it's all about the knowledge, and really that's where today sits. And so off the back of that, we run this series of lunchtime webinars. We've been running them for over 3 years now. And really they give us a chance to, I suppose, showcase what we do on the non-exam side. They give you a taster of our training courses. And just in terms of examples, just to show you the kind of breadth of training that we do, and in no particular order, we've run sessions on Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, so those whizzy methods of storing and transferring value. We've had some macroeconomic updates at quite interesting times actually in the UK economy. So we had a post-COVID macroeconomic update. So that was kind of a, where's it going to go from here? We also had a post-Liz Truss actually last year, macroeconomic update, which was another, where's it going to go from here? And just referencing it into this session, last year we did a more generalist, I would call it, ESG session with Duffy, so some of you might have attended that. It was really well attended, and so we wanted to do something that was related to it, but probably just a little bit more niche. And so, as you can see from the title today, we're more aimed at climate change, climate risk, and so that's going to be the theme of today. So I guess it's a little bit of a subset if you attended the last ESG session of that session in itself. Now, I've introduced myself, and so Christian, you're driving. I wouldn't mind if you want to pop to the next slide. There we are. We've got the smiley face. It's black and white, which is a little bit more flattering. So I've introduced myself, and taking the main presentation today is Christian Spindler, who you can see there is the co-founder of Sustain Account, which is a company which, is part of what it does, quantifies climate risk at a corporate level and gives advice on mitigation. Now, Christian, if you don't mind me introducing you, Christian's had a long-standing passion for combining sustainable finance with digital transformation. At this stage, I'm just pleased to get through that sentence because there are some quite complicated words in there. And you have an impressive resume, if you don't mind me saying so, including speaking at the Paris conference in 2015, which I think, if my numbers are right, was COP21. So Christian will be taking over in a second when I've dealt with my second slide. I've only got 3. And so you're in good hands with Christian in terms of the presentation itself. So if you wouldn't mind, thank you very much. Getting good at this, popping to the next slide. So I just wanted to quickly reference ESG into Kaplan before we get going in full. So I mentioned that we do exam training and we do non-exam training. You may be aware that CF Institute, that administers the CFA qualification globally, has more recently started to oversee an ESG qualification, which is a certificate in ESG. It's proving quite popular. It's only been available for 2 years actually, and numbers are starting to increase quite rapidly. In the UK, around about 2,500 registrations are taking place each year, which puts it on a par with IMC, which is a UK qualification which has been around for a good 10 or 15 years, so it is proving popular. And if you do want to know more about the qualification, or actually our quite whizzy on-demand product for that, then we are here to help with that. As well as that, we do tailored programs, so bespoke training, and so we can make something that's more focused to your needs. In terms of a typical course length, really it tends to be about 1 day, but we do also do a modular approach where you can build up 3-hour modules and create a pathway in that way if you want to. So there is a QR code actually in the top right hand corner of the screen. I'll actually pop it on the closing slide as well, so you can see it at the end, but it does take you to the right section of our website if today whets your appetite, or maybe you're on the call just to find out a bit more about ESG and what we do. And if there's anyone in your organisation that would like to talk to us, then we'd be happy to do that. So that's where we sit there. Do you want to move on to the next slide, Christian? Thank you very much. Now, just before I do hand over formally to Christian, I just want to cover a little bit of parish notices to just the mechanics behind this. So we have chat on and we can see your chats coming through. So the medium for communication is chat. It's one-way audio, so you can't take yourself off audio and ask questions if that's what you'd like to do. Just in terms of features, there will be a few little challenges for you, so make sure you're kind of close to your keyboards and ready to type in responses, because that will happen at least a couple of times as we head through the slide pack. If you'd like to ask questions, then please do. And if you could type those into chat as we go, then either, Christian can see them as well, by the way, so either Christian will deal with those real time, or we are going to leave a little bit of time at the end to gather questions together as well. And I just know from presenting these things, sometimes if you're on a roll, it's quite good just to keep it going and then gather the questions up at the end. So really it depends what comes through as to whether we deal with it straight away or not. In terms of basic timings, we're looking to make the presentation last around about 40 minutes or so, so we can leave 10 or 15 minutes for questions at the end. These things are sometimes a little bit uncertain, but that's the plan. So with that, Christian, I'm going to hand over to you, sir, and I hope you will enjoy the presentation, and I will, as I say, catch up with you when we get towards the end.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jeremy, for a kind introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm looking so much forward to spend the next hour with you. This is really an interesting topic, and the fact that you are in here and listening to us and contributing in the discussion is showing that you are also interested in this racing topic. So as Jeremy introduced, we will be talking about climate risk to the greatest extent. Jeremy, you were saying it's a bit of subset of the ESG topic. I do my very best, to extend it across that and give you some new insights, because we were looking, for instance, into a financial climate risk topic, but I have here revised, particularly standing because it's really something that you might and certainly would have come over in the past, but we have some new approaches that I would really like to convey you with these slides here. And then we were looking into transition and physical risk modeling and show you some case studies around that, and that will round up the next hour, I would say. Yes, as Jeremy told you, we are a sustain account. We are doing software in the core, so digital tools to do modeling on the transition and physical risk side. And we also act as an agency, because we still see there's so much need for knowledge built up in the world, in the financial institutions, and also in the non-financial corporate world. And we are acting then as trainers, as consultants as well, besides the software that we are developing and offering. So with that, let's start a little bit. And what we did is prepared a bit an icebreaker for you in terms of just for fun question. So I would expect that an educated audience as you would have no difficulties answering that question here. What does net zero mean? So net zero, you hear it all the time. So what is it? Is it the ambition as an economy to not add any more carbon to the atmosphere by 2050? Or would you say it's more a goal of a company to fully stop carbon emissions in their operation and supply chains by 2050? Would you say it's a calendar reform proposal to start counting years from new by starting with 0 in 2050? Or would you say it's an ambition of the world to achieve 0 degree warming compared to pre-industrial level by 2050? So what do you think? Maybe you write a few answers in the chat, and I keep the chat window open here. Yeah, A is good, huh? You're certainly recognized there's too many A's on that slide here. Yeah, you're very flexible, huh? There's A2, A2, B, you rename it to B. Rename it to A. Okay, let's thank you very much. Let's click one further ahead. Yes, you may argue if it's the ambition of an economy to not add, or ambition of a company to not add any more carbon emissions. Well, I think that the crucial word here is net zero, right? You of course, we want to have no more carbon added as to the best, global economy in 2050. But this leaves the leeway for individual companies to, of course, emit more carbon. This will be unavoidable. Think of chemical fuels that we are using in the ships, planes, and cars, and of processes that are just hard to electrify So there will be still some carbon emissions likely. However, we do our best to provide then either carbon sinks or provide sustainable fuels or green electricity to fuel these operations. And so it's really the ambition for an economy to not add more carbon. Now, you may ask the question, why is it so much on the agenda these days to do so? And I think picture says more than 1,000 words. First picture is the following. That's Western Germany in summer 2021, where the very, very tiny river R was not so tiny anymore, and you could see these devastating events. I mean, compared to the earthquake in Turkey and Syria, it's not devastating, but for these kind of people, it was. And this is a climate-related impact, right? So that's you could attribute it to heavy rain events before, kind of weeks before, and then accumulating in a very wet and sucked soil, and then only a bit more of rain really led to this catastrophic event of this little river swelling up and then kind of damaging almost the entire village here. And this is one event with too much water. Last year there were many events with too little water. So this is the Rhine River at the location around Düsseldorf, Duisburg in Germany, heavily populated normally by cargo ships and many more vessels. And you can see during that hot summer and dry summer last year how the Rhine, besides many other rivers in Europe, dried strongly away. And this has economic consequences, right? We don't see any building damages here or anything like that. But if you're sitting on that river and if your processes are depending on cooling water, or you're having a logistics company and you're doing barge shipping inland, then you have a problem with that kind of weather conditions. And over that, processes in the real economy then obviously would experience severe financial risks. And so let's look a bit into that topic. So intro into financial risks revised. So let's have a look why revised. One aspect why revised is because it is finally back at the agenda. So this is the top 10 risks out of this year's World Economic Forum, where you have short-term risks on the left-hand side and long-term risk on the right-hand side. And obviously that geopolitical crises and cost of living inflation crisis ranks top in the short term, but on the long term, you see all green, and green means some kind of natural risk that you have here, failure to mitigate and adapt to climate change at the top two, and then the nature and biodiversity risks in 3 and 4. So that is very severe here, and I think the picture showed you that this is something to consider ever more in future. Now, this is one thing of the revision. The second thing is that obviously all the regulation around reporting, analyzing, disclosing, and then also mitigating and adapting climate change picks really up. So you have a lot of drivers regarding regarding climate transition risks here on the example of real estate, for instance, on the left-hand side, and regulation is one of them. We have zero emission ambitions for the real estate sector in Europe. We have stranded asset discussions, where you have buildings that kind of are in such a bad ecologic shape in terms of energy consumption that you are not able to market them anymore, and sell them or rent them out for new. And this is also taken up obviously by investors and by the tenants themselves, so the customers of buildings, if you like, the tenants. And this is also then felt by increasing extreme weather events. So there are various regulations. I mean, EU taxonomy and SFDR and so on is one of them. And then finally, if you look, of course, into the consultancies like McKinsey has also very pointed opinions on that. So having said that, let's look a bit into first transition risk, and then I will also come back to physical risk and show you what we can newly do on solving analytical and disclosure questions, and then finally risk mitigation around those topics. I will start with an introduction to current best practices in transition risk modeling. Transition risk, just a recap for those of you who are a bit newer to climate-related risks. We differentiate climate risk into those two things, physical and transition risk. Now, physical risk is everything that is related to natural disasters, either on an event basis, on an ad hoc basis, or on a chronic basis. So chronic disaster would be sea level rise, where you just over time would see that your coastlines are not habitable anymore or not insurable also anymore. And ad hoc disasters would be something like I showed you in the pictures, like extreme precipitation, extreme drought, extreme heat waves, extreme storms, and things like that. So that's the physical side of things. And I showed you already that it is not related to building damage and things like that only, but it also comes down to real economic value chain interruptions and consequences. Transition risks, on the other side, are related to the question of the reaction of policymakers and of the greater public, of the consumers also, on the fact that climate change is happening and that people want to do something about it. So if policymakers say we want to do something about climate change and come to the idea that a carbon tax on a certain sector or energy consumption or whatever would do the job, then there is a risk that you have to pay as a company a tax, an elevated tax maybe on your future emissions. And that is a risk because it may happen in the future. And as soon as it materializes, you have a materialized risk, you know that it's happening. Carbon tax is always the key example for transition risk, but you of course have reputational risks in there. So you're doing something like greenwashing, and then people get nervous about it and accuse you for greenwashing, or you're doing as a company on the other side doing something innovative and that leads to much improved competitive position in terms of energy transition. You can sell your products in a much broader way because you're doing something to foster energy transition, for instance. Then that would also be a transition effect. You would gain more money from that, but it would be a transition opportunity in that sense. So, having said that, the frameworks about climate risks, it's also about climate risks and opportunities, of course. And we should all do our best to transform, if not able to transform climate risk and opportunities, but then rather to, exploit all the climate opportunities that we see for our companies. Okay, so transition risk modeling best practices. I will do the discussion around a working paper that was written not so far from where I am located. So this is at the ETH, Federal University in Zurich, in Switzerland. My home is not, I think, on that picture, but it is somewhere close. And I am quite familiar with the authors of that as well, namely Julia Bingler, who did an amazing job in putting that research together, and recently published also a piece of AI that scrambles through sustainability reports and estimates how greenwashed they are or not of companies. But here we're talking about climate transition risk metrics, understanding the convergence and divergence across firm and providers. Why is it important? Yeah, because we have many providers and many data sources and many methods to assess climate transition risks. It's not a hard science. It's something where you have some room for interpretation and room for kind of different approaches. And so we're looking into questions of when I analyze a certain company for transition risks and I analyze it through two providers, do I get the same result or not? And it turns out that it's very hard to get the same result. And this is due to the fact that we have different approaches on the one side, and then on the other side, different data sets and assumptions and so on. And that makes it ever more clear that if you want to do such an exercise or have to do a reporting on or stress testing on climate-related risk, you must really also look behind what is in the assumptions of the analysis performed. And here you can see a bit of criteria along which climate risk providers have been assessed. You see the numbers here, 13 and 3. This is about 16. So this is about 16, providers that have been assessed in that publication. If you have a look at it, you will see them all. And they have been assessed regarding accountability of the analysis, depth of the risk analysis, and then also finally usability for instance, the financial services functions, risk analysts, also investor relations in companies, and so on. And you can see that this is a kind of a free level score. Most of them scored medium. There's some in the usability scored low, and we want to look a bit more into the detail now, how these numbers come into place. So let's start with accountability. This is accountability of different providers regarding climate transition risks. And here you can see that particularly in the public transparency and in the third-party verification and peer review, most of the methodologies today are mediocre, so to say. Well, third-party verification peer review is definitely hard for if you want to sell a methodology, right? Because then you have to disclose, of course, everything down to the details and can be reverse engineered. But this is the situation for accountability. I think, to my personal view, more interesting is the depth of risk analysis, where you can see how good are different risks covered in the different analysis and vendors. And you have risks which are very good, well covered today. This is, for instance, the current greenhouse gas emissions. Well, it's not so difficult, right? You basically read them from the publications, from the sustainability reports of the companies, right? That's not the problem. Where it's more of a problem if you are looking then into effects that are creating feedback loops and things like that, particularly in the financial system. So you would see here risk of amplification coverage, a mutual risk amplification, or financial market amplification of climate risk. That is where the models currently are a bit weak. And then regarding usability, there's the question of if I, as a financial services let's say research analyst, want to do a transition analysis on my investment portfolio or on my loan portfolio or in a single company, how well can I access these models and how well can I use it? Am I getting a black box, or can I get really some transparency and so on? And what do I learn also from the outputs? And there you see that the communication of the assumptions is a weak spot in the current landscape, and then also methodologies related to how do certain risk numbers come into place. Here, there's something like probability distribution input and probability distribution output. That's I don't go into the depth here, but that's some detailed technical question that really, if more people would do that, would improve the result of the final risk analysis that is done. So now we looked at that and said, what can be done better? And we came up with an approach where the first time the revision that I advertised at the beginning.
I don't know whether you can hear me, but I think I've lost your sound at the moment.
You lost my sound?
It's still coming through fine.
Do you want to keep speaking?
It's coming through? Let me see what the chat says.
Yeah,
it's
if we
okay.
just check with the chat, Jeremy, I can hear fine.
Thank you very much. Okay, so let me continue. If anything is, then also write me, because then the Zoom pops up and I will also see it.
I think it's just me.
Very good. Okay, cool. So we looked at that and said, okay, what can we do better? And we come up with an approach that now takes a bit more the question of risk a bit more holistically into account. So the first thing is that the scenarios that are used to look into what's happening into the future, those scenarios are very rigid and hard to understand. So we opened that up and said, okay, there's one ingredient, curiosity and openness, we called it, about possible future worlds. So we worked together with a UK-based future foresights company, Sami Consulting it's called. And this, what you see here, is a scenario set, qualitative scenario set that actually entered also into a European Union strategy paper on transition scenarios, where you can see, the different worlds that we could possibly head to, and then you can, for yourself and for your situation in the company or for your situation with an investment portfolio and so on, think about, okay, which scenario do I find most likely? And then develop the future, the further discussion around climate risk analysis along that scenario. Yeah, and then you have a much more storyline based setting how you can define such scenarios, and don't have to go only to NGFS and pick one and live with it, but have more a storyline setting how you can set up scenarios of the future, and how that affects particularly the industry or investment world you're located in. So that's ingredient one. After that ingredient, you maybe say, well, we are now in an oak scenario, and this is more like kind of the exclusionary resisting change economic scenario. And around that, you can derive metrics. What would it mean for carbon taxes? What would it mean for carbon costs per ton? What would it mean for energy prices and also the energy mix? First ingredient. Second ingredient, a much more improved modeling on the quantitative side now on the options of companies, how to develop in future. So this schema, it shows you how such a quantitative modeling is done. So we take for a company, current emissions, current fundamentals, let's say a digital twin of a company as it is right now, also the industry where it is in and so on. And then this company has certain options to come to net zero or come to any other carbon target in the future. And if you combine that with what came out from the qualitative scenarios, take the measures and put them in here, you can model yourself forward to a, let's say, an investment and optimal transition pathway where you have investments optimally dispersed over the next years and emissions then coming down along a certain pathway. What ingredients do you need to do that in particular? Well, the scenarios is one side, and we're talking about costs, capacities for production, capacities for energy production, capacities also on the market demand side of things. So this is things that is now on the one side informed by the qualitative scenarios, on the other side obviously orients on NGFS climate scenarios and so on. And then we introduce would say a novelty to a certain extent. This is dynamic abatement options, as we call it. So you may know abatement options. I think McKinsey did not invent the term, but they made it big, saying, okay, I have several options to abate carbon dioxide emissions. I can line them up along an axis, and I order them in the order of costs. So they are very expensive options on the right-hand side. For instance, if you have solar plants or solar PV panels on, the idea is to put them on the street and so on. So very expensive things and does not yield a lot of savings. But you also have very cheap options for a company. And this is the typical low-hanging fruits, like a better heat insulation, LED lighting, and so on. And those things actually extend into the negative costs over the lifetime, because the investments are compensated quite early from saved electricity costs, and then you earn money over the time by making such an abatement. So that's the logic behind abatement curves. And the novelty that we introduce here is that we are not taking them as static, but we are considering technological progress. So if you think about hydrogen economy, for instance, this is very expensive and not profitable at the moment, but we can already foresee that with the investment in research that is going in and in development, that it will shift from a so-called technical readiness level, TRL, of say 6 currently to 9 in a few years. And then if hydrogen is located here today, then in a few years, it may be already located here. And these effects we're taking into account, meaning we can then say, okay, wait, dear company, it doesn't make sense to invest in hydrogen today. Wait 5 years, you get a better deal when you invest then, and still be able then to reach your decarbonization targets along all the other scenarios and assumptions. Okay, so that's the way we are creating then and modeling and creating then the optimal transition pathways. We tried it on quite some examples. I want to show you one of the case studies about the global cargo fleet. So decarbonization of cargo shipping is definitely a topic, and what you see here is the fleet count in I think in blue, and the fraction of CO2 emissions in orange of different ship classes. So the Panamax ships are the very large vessels that go around the world, and the feeder ships, they are going more like in the North Sea and in the Baltic Sea and from harbor to harbor and distributing the cargo. And you can see that those are obviously number-wise, they are very many. Average fleet emission is very small because such a ship is small compared to the Panamax class, but because they are so high in number, the fractional CO2 emission is also very high. So we look particularly into what can we do with decarbonization of feeder technology, so feeder ships. And we looked again in a more detailed industry scenario, what can we do in the combination of the UK refinery sector that is on the risk of parts of its products getting stranded, less demand for fossil fuel-based chemical fuels, but the infrastructure is still there, and what can you do in combination with the feeder shipping decarbonization, for instance? And where you can look into is, for instance, the fuel pathways for shipping. So that's an example from today up to 2050 on the fractional demand of certain fuels, where you still have the fuel oil currently dominating the market, obviously, but then this will go down, and ammonia and bioenergy and hydrogen particularly will pick up and replace fuel oil from here. Now, these numbers do not come from us. This is scenarios from International Maritime Agency and other organizations that are looking into these market dynamics. But what we do now is we put it into our transition calculation engine and can then derive risks and cash flows and optimal investment pathways for both the refinery industry and for the shipping industry to see when are optimal investment points to switch to other fuel technologies, for instance. So I go a bit further here, but this is one chart of the biofuel pathway for a net zero related strategy. So that is very much in line, for instance, with the UK net zero strategy issued, I think, 1.5 years or 2 years ago. The scenario taking from the Network for Greening Financial Systems, where you can see the accumulated emission savings here, according to that scenario, adding up to 4 megatons per year in 2050, and then annualized saved carbon taxes with, scenario emissions, scenario estimations on the carbon tax amount accumulating up to $300 million for this biofuel pathway for the feeder ship industry. So this is all things we can get out here. And here you can also see an optimal biofuel investment pathway for a specific refinery plant in the UK, where you can see, no, it's not that you should, invest kind of everything today and also not everything in 2040, but we can calculate here an optimal pathway that leads to an optimal profit, and in the end, by in the same way feeding the needed capacity on the market. So let's close up this discussion about transition risk. And again, I want to wake you up in this middle of the webinar a little bit with a question around what are the financial risks of climate change. And here I give you a few examples where we have not yet talked about. It's a risk of global supply chain, increasingly vulnerable to tropical storms. So is that a climate risk? Or is it kind of risk of production stops due to water shortage? Maybe that's a climate risk. And also risk of assets defaulting to political bans. Do you think that's a climate risk? So maybe you can again give me some answers, and I see they're popping in. A4, A3, yes, A3, A4, A4, and 444. So I think you agree that all of those 3 risks are climate related risk, and that's pretty easy. That's why the question is also called just for fun, but it makes you aware that, it's not all about, damages of infrastructure and buildings, but it's really more than that. All right, let me have a brief look at the time. So we are quite good to start off also with physical risks for investment portfolios. And also there, I want to give you a bit of revision of current state and what we can do now, a bit an update how this could look like. For instance, related to heavy rain, extreme precipitation, what can be done there? So following answers can be very much straightforward answered. How high is the risk? what is the cost of doing nothing? What can you do to mitigate the risk, for a certain setting, be it a real estate portfolio or in infrastructure portfolio? And is it okay to do this? This is a bit a funny question, but the background is the do no significant harm criteria of the EU taxonomy, for instance, or the principal adverse impact indicators of the SFDR that always ask, like, you do something against climate change or for climate risk mitigation, but take care that you do not harm other protection goals. This could be biodiversity or water or circular economy and things like that. So this is meant with, is it okay to do this? We can also, of course, clarify if a certain mitigation or adaptation measure is in line with the DNSH criteria. And the next thing we will do is what will it cost to do it? So also costs of adaptation and mitigation measures. So to be more precise, how does physical risk express itself? Taking real estate, you may first think, of course, on about damages, but I repeatedly told you it's not only about damages. This is one thing, but it's also about the well-being of people. Because if you have, let's say, an urban heat island, high wet bulb temperatures, and you have workers that work partly outdoors, partly indoors, and so on, there are many studies that show that certain climate conditions affect productivity. So if you need a study to kind of know this, if you are in downtown London at a hot summer day, you may know that yourself. And so that's also something that can be quantified and should be quantified if you really take climate risk and physical climate risk fully into account in its impacts on the economy. And then on the other side, there's something like a value of the building, the functional and utilization value of the building that can be hampered by climate risk. Basic example is the ski resort in the Alps that is maybe only at 1,000 meters above sea level, where the snow conditions are not like as they were 30 years ago, and where you may now question the future cash flow outlooks of such a ski resort compared to one neighboring one, which is on the 2,500 meter level. So also that sort of question comes into play. And we had formally the discussion about production plants at rivers that need cooling water and have the risk of not getting a cooling water in summer times when rivers dry out or get too hot. So all of that we take into account and produce outputs like the following. Here you can see a chart that shows you different climate hazards at the bottom. It shows you different risk levels here on the in the vertical axis, expressed in a climate value at risk. If you know the MSCI ratings, they do similar things as we do here, and others as well. And you can see that we are showing results in two ways. First of all, assets without adaptation, they have certain risk. And then we also classify, what can we do about it? Yeah. And then the risk with adaptation to climate change will hopefully go down. So that's the second number we are doing. And then we can, if we want or are mandated, also do that regarding a benchmark of peer real estate, peer infrastructure, or peer economic processes to see how is that structured in a portfolio from risk perspectives. So that's the risk, and then obviously we're looking into the abatement options as well. And there's an entire taxonomy now developed related to abatement options. First of all, you would, if you have an option like a dam or a strengthening of some building or a roof kind of a roof strengthening, or some natural or nature-based solution like a facade greening or so. If you have something like that, the first question you ask is, are there more than a particular risk addressed simultaneously? Because then you can get synergies. So for taking a green roof on a building, for instance, the green roof cools the building to a certain extent, and it cools also the PV installations that are maybe on top of that building. And in addition, it can soak up water in heavy rain events. So it has mutual it has many benefits, synergetic benefits to many processes. Then classification of the adaptation measures is one thing. Yeah, you can do structural measures, but you can also do risk monitoring that costs you much less, or you can do temporary measures. For instance, temporary flood protection is cheaper than if you have a constructed flood protection, a permanent one. Then obviously we're looking into the DNSH criteria. That's clear. We look who can bear the costs. So is it really the owners, the investors into a building or into the infrastructure, or can it be insurers? Can it be tenants, or can it be also public funds that can help bearing the cost for adaptation? And then this is just, for you to think about it a bit, an outlook. What we're also looking into is how can we bring the concept of CO2 sinks together with the adaptation measures. And there we're looking into things like you have a biochar. Biochar is a carbon sink, right? And you can mix biochar into cement and produce a special wall with special properties out of that. And if you're constructing a climate adaptation measure out of such a biochar enforced cement, then your adaptation measure is also acting as a carbon sink, and this can be accounted for, and so on. So we're looking also into these combinations. Now you may ask yourself also how does this look like? So what do we provide? So on the one side, we're providing data strongly via REST API. So that's the major channel, how you can get data and how customers get data from these analysis, hooking up to a API, shifting over portfolios, and then the results are coming back, and shifting over individual infrastructural building characteristics, and results are coming back. That's one thing. And on the other thing, we're providing also a web-based SaaS software to demonstrate, to visualize, to report, to have a more interactive way of dealing with the climate risk analysis. So I think we are very well in time. This is basically what I wanted to show you, a bit of revision of what you may have known about climate risk analysis before. And I hope I could give you an impression that we can really do that in a more granular way than the first generation of climate risk approaches that have been developed a few years ago. And we still, Jeremy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we have time for questions.
We do. That is the most accurate timing I've ever done on a public webinar, I have to say. Spot on with 15 minutes to go. So thank you for that. As promised, here they come. There's normally a nervous pause before they come in. We're going to leave time for questions. So they're going to come through on chat. So please use your chat if you do have questions. Christian, you can see them coming through as well. So feel free to pick them up as they come in.
You can see it, and let's really read through it. I think that's the most convenient thing. So wasn't it 2020 when the planes and cars stopped polluting and the rivers cleared, for instance, in Venice? That's true. Why is climate related? The rain. Why is climate related the rain in Germany? How do the demanding change new economy models mitigate risk, for instance, covering citizens in big centers for emerging countries in the Balkans, Cardiac location-based scenarios and capacities, London versus rest of UK, if everyone forced to move, could reach net zero faster, but at the expense of citizen well-being. Yeah, true, okay. And if a company wants to minimize environmental footprint accounting for cobalt extraction, hydrogen investments should be preferred, but the race to net zero opens market opportunities for battery electrification, notably the UK example. You're touching with those statements. They are very diverse, but you're touching always the same question, namely, to which level of detail you're going down in the modeling, in which kind of processes do you model? We solve this kind of problem by saying we can connect a certain process to sub-processes as we like, yes, structurally, and as soon as there's need for it, we can do it, and we can also provide feedback loops. So for instance, let's take one of them. Let's take, for instance, the the cobalt extraction here for the companies is a very good example, because we touched upon it strongly when we did the case study with the refineries, and also another one where we looked into the alternative of leather and artificial fabrics for car seats, for car interiors, with the same methodology. So we said, okay, look, if you're doing a certain process as a company, you're taking leather for the seats, so natural leather or artificial leather. You have some carbon emissions. One process has more emissions than the other. You also have biodiversity impact and water impact and so on. But then you need to go to your suppliers and say, okay, how many carbon emissions are there, and how many other processes happening there that may impair, for instance, on those do no significant harm processes. Meaning, if you like to kind of formulate it in more known terms, we are doing a full-scale blown up life cycle analysis of the processes that we are looking into, and qualifying these processes regarding to carbon emissions, regarding to the other externalities of the taxonomy, biodiversity, and so on, in a hierarchical way, going from the process to the sub-process to the sub-sub-process and so on. And if you do that, now another technical term, you end up with a system dynamic model. You change anything very early on in the value chain, and this propagates through. Maybe there's a feedback loop in it, and so on. And what we do is we try to kind of model as good as possible, and to an extent where it still makes economic sense, of course, these processes, so that we can look exactly into those things. For instance, what does cobalt extraction, how does that interfere ESG and or risk-wise with the opportunity that you want to have electric batteries in some economy? So a very general answer, but I think the question is also on that level, so I hope it matched a bit.
We've got another one in here from Henrik as well, Christian, which is actually slightly easier to summarize. So with regard to it, I'll let you read that one. There we are.
Do you see any upcoming legislation that would harmonize benchmarking? There is the International Sustainability Standards Board. They're kind of the go-together of the GRI, if I'm not mistaken, the Global Reporting Initiative, and the IFRS, the accounting organization. And they are in the process of issuing the next and hopefully, well done step of integrated accounting. Integrated accounting being the process that you are doing the financial accounting in terms of CapEx and OpEx and balance sheets and P&Ls and so on, and taking that and applying it in a, say, similar way to accounting for externalities, carbon for the one side, and then other externalities will definitely follow. And I do strongly I'm a fan of that, and do recommend that, and I wish them all the best to kind of bring that standard out very soon, and have companies adapt to that standard easily, because then we are in that world where you are envisioning that we can have a harmonized benchmarking possibility that is good for us all, for investors, for researchers, also for corporates that want to benchmark themselves and put out their, competitive edges and so on. So I bet on the International Sustainability Standards Board. What I will supply you with in the aftermath via you, Jeremy, is a little white paper where you can see the methodology that I showed you on the slides, where we put it into a paper, and where we are referring also to that process of treating carbon and other externalities, CapEx and OpEx wise, in the same way as financial accounting does it as well.
Great. So hopefully, Henrik, that gives you the answer you need. Just off the back of that, is there a, no problem, is there, for the layman, the average man on the street, a way of gauging success in this area? So we've talked about standardized benchmarking. It sounds as though there isn't one. What kind of things can you look out for now to gauge progress?
Progress in decarbonization itself, or in the approaches?
Yeah, just but at a low level, if you're if you're of interest.
Yeah. No, I mean, you can always monitor your emission levels. That there's so many tools out there where you can just say, okay, look, I give a few data points and I monitor my emissions, and then I see how much I'm really responsible for climate change. Yeah, and you can do that on the lower level, private persons. You can do that on a nation's level. Then it's done by the statistical offices, and this data is all available, so you can look that up. In terms of the risk discussion that we have here, I think, I mean, on a professional side, that's the more interesting discussion, because for long term, long decades, you might say, nobody was interested in emissions. Yeah, only when we start telling financial services that there's a financial risk in high emissions because of the legislation changes and so on, then people got interested. And therefore, this indirect effect is very much more interesting. And a little bit an advertisement, but it will not be kind of relevant for this audience anyway. We started to do a YouTube channel on exactly that. Yeah, so educating the, how do you say in English, Tom, Dick, and Harry on the street,
yeah.
and, on climate-related risk, because it affects our all pension funds. Yeah, if you have a pension fund investing in UK real estate, and we have a flood coming through, and which could have been foreseen, but not all foresee it, and have it on their accounts, then it's UK pensions that are at risk. And therefore, this is the things we want to get over via the YouTube channel, in a much different language than we spoke today. But this happens and will be coming. But it's in German, so that's why I said it's not relevant for this very audience.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Let's have a look. So I think any more. So anything you've always wanted to ask but never dared. I think we're exhausted our questions. Okay. So hopefully everyone's happy at that stage. Christian, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to tidy up. Can you just pop to I think there's one more slide that we've got at the end, just a holding slide to finish. And so let me just tidy everything up. So firstly, thank you, Christian, for coming and presenting to us. I hope everybody found that interesting. I certainly did. Just in terms of a follow-up, number one, actually, I'm just going to pop in the chat box now. A feedback link. So we're giving you 7 minutes back on the planned time. So if you're about to just quickly rush off and have a sandwich and want to give us feedback, we're always interested to know what you think, so we can mold future presentations. So if you could spend some time on that, that would be much appreciated. So feel free to click on that and complete the feedback form, which is nice and short and sharp. You will receive a follow-up email to this session. And as Christian mentioned, we're going to put some interesting reading on it for you. So links to various articles that you might want to see. We're also going to include a copy of this presentation, the recording, sorry, of this presentation. So you can watch that back if you need to. We spoke earlier quickly about ESG at Kaplan as well. And so I've actually put the QR code on this holding slide at the back as well. So if you do need to get to that quickly so you can get to the right section of the website, then that's all there for you. And so beyond that, apart from thanking everybody for coming and hoping that you enjoyed it, and also hoping that we see you at future events, we do run these at the moment about on a 3 to 6 month basis. And so you'll see through the normal channels, the Kaplan newsletter, LinkedIn and so on, the subject matter that we're looking at. So we hope that we see you again in future, and thanks for attending. So catch up next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Christian.